It began with a smirk. Stephen Miller leaned forward, his voice dipped in arrogance, and the cameras caught every ounce of his smug confidence. He believed he had crafted the perfect gotcha moment, the kind of rhetorical trap that would box his opponent into silence. He looked across the table, eyes gleaming, and delivered his line. "Tell me, Congresswoman, if you believe in America so much, why do your policies seem designed to undermine its very foundation?" The room went still, as though Miller's words carried an invisible weight. The way he asked it, sharp and venomous, was meant to not only corner Jasmine Crockett but humiliate her, reduce her into just another soundbite for his followers. His body language screamed victory before the exchange had even begun. In Miller's mind, the duel was already won. But the camera didn't stay on him for long. It cut, instead, to Jasmine Crockett. Her face was unreadable for a heartbeat. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in the unmistakable calm of someone who had faced harder battles than this moment could ever deliver. She did not flinch. She did not scramble for an answer. She simply waited, letting the silence build like a storm cloud on the horizon. The audience watching felt it, the tension, the suspense, the electricity of a woman who knew she was not about to be anyone's victim. Crockett's silence was louder than Miller's entire monologue. The smugness on his face began to curdle as though he hadn't anticipated resistance, hadn't considered what it would mean to face someone who wasn't intimidated by his posturing. And then, with a calmness that pierced the room like a blade through glass, Crockett's lips curled ever so slightly. The kind of look that told everyone in the room, and everyone watching at home, that Miller had just walked into something he could not control. This wasn't just another political jab. This was a showdown. A moment that would echo beyond the walls of that debate, beyond the glow of the cameras, into the bloodstream of American discourse. Miller thought he had cornered her, but what happened in the next 30 seconds would flip the script entirely. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to step back and see the battlefield it was staged upon. Stephen Miller is no stranger to the political spotlight. For years, he's thrived on provocation, a figure who built his career on drawing hard lines and daring anyone to cross them. As the ideological architect of some of the most hardline policies in modern American memory, Miller has always worn his contempt for pluralism like a badge of honor. He speaks in absolutes. He wields fear like a weapon. His version of America is fortress-like, rigid, exclusionary. A place where belonging is rationed to the few and denied to the many. On the other side stands Jasmine Crockett, not a creature of backroom strategy, not a man of inherited privilege, but a woman who climbed her way into the halls of power by fighting battles most people never see. Her voice doesn't rise from ivory towers. It rises from courtrooms, neighborhoods, in communities where survival and justice are not abstract ideas but daily struggles. She represents a new current, a tide pushing into American politics with authenticity, unapologetic pride, and the refusal to bow to intimidation. When these two worlds collided, it wasn't just a debate. It was a collision between two competing visions of what America means. To Miller, America is a story to be guarded, its chapters closed to outsiders, its heroes cast in narrow molds. To Crockett, America is unfinished, a story still being written, one that welcomes new voices, new heroes. It dares to expand the very idea of belonging. That's why the moment carried such weight. It wasn't only about the barbs traded across a debate table. It was about whether arrogance and exclusion could still intimidate, or whether dignity and defiance could finally shift the ground beneath them. Every glare, every pause, every word between them carried the gravity of history pressing down on the present, and the audience knew it. Those watching live leaned in not just because of the spectacle, but because they sensed something larger was at stake. The room itself seemed charged with more than political electricity. It carried the tension of centuries of battles over who gets to claim the soul of America, who gets to define its ideals, and who must forever fight to be included in its promise. Miller thought this was just another stage for him to flex, another opportunity to belittle. What he failed to grasp was that Crockett wasn't there to play by his rules. She wasn't there to cower, to soften, to nod politely while he spoke down to her. She was there as the embodiment of a truth Miller couldn't suppress, that America's future would not be dictated by smug condescension, but by the strength of those who refused to be silenced. And so, as the cameras positioned themselves, as the microphones caught every breath, two figures faced one another across that stage. One carried the old armor of fear and division. The other carried a quiet but unshakable belief in dignity and resilience. The stakes could not have been higher, and neither of them could disguise the fact that this moment was bigger than either name on the screen. Because when the first words were spoken, when the opening blows were delivered, it became clear this was not just another debate. This was the moment when two Americas collided. And when the cameras rolled, the nation didn't just watch a debate. It watched a reckoning. Stephen Miller has always thrived in the shadows of power. A figure who understood early on that words sharpened to a blade's edge could be more dangerous than armies. As a young man, he mastered the art of provocation, discovering that outrage could be currency. He spoke with an air of certainty that carried him through lecture halls and right into the bloodstream of conservative politics. But beneath that air of authority, there was something else in need: to dominate, to belittle, to control the narrative before it ever controlled him. When Miller ascended to national prominence as a senior advisor in the Trump White House, he didn't come quietly. He came like a storm. His fingerprints appeared on some of the most divisive policies in recent memory: the travel bans that targeted Muslim-majority countries, the family separations at the border that seared themselves into the conscience of America, the endless speeches painting immigrants not as neighbors but as threats. These were not slips of rhetoric or errors in judgment. They were deliberate. Each crafted word was a calculated strike. It's designed to draw a line between us and them, to define America not by its promise, but by its exclusions. And Miller reveled in it. He became the face of a hardline ideology that cloaked cruelty in the language of security and sovereignty. In press conferences, he sparred with reporters, cutting them off mid-sentence with condescending lectures. His smirk became infamous, his dismissive tone a calling card. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he had not only mastered the rules of politics, but had rewritten them in his image. Yet, time and again, observers noticed something underneath. For all the bravado, for all the tightly scripted lines, Miller often reacted with visible agitation when challenged. The mask slipped when questions cut too close, when his authority was not immediately accepted. His brilliance was undeniable. His ability to craft sound bites and strategies that dominated headlines proved that. But brilliance does not erase insecurity. And Miller's pattern was clear. He struck first, struck hard, and relied on intimidation to keep others from ever daring to strike back. This was his playbook. In every exchange, he assumed his opponents would falter, that the sheer force of his confidence would overwhelm them. And for years, it worked. Politicians stumbled under his barbed remarks. Commentators took his words at face value. Even seasoned journalists found themselves flustered by his rapid-fire dismissals. Miller knew how to keep people on the defensive. But there's a danger in leaning too heavily on a single strategy. Over time, arrogance calcifies into blindness. When you believe every opponent will crumble, you stop preparing for the one who won't. And Miller had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Crockett didn't enter the room carrying the weight of fear. She carried something far more powerful: the experience of a lifetime spent refusing to be silenced. She wasn't intimidated by sharp rhetoric. She had sparred with louder voices, fought on tougher stages, and endured battles where the stakes weren't reputations but lives. Miller, wrapped in his own confidence, didn't see it coming. That's the irony of Stephen Miller's persona. He crafted himself as the master strategist, the man always 2 steps ahead. But what happens when the script doesn't play out the way it always has? What happens when the smirk meets someone who doesn't flinch? When the lecture falls flat against someone who refuses to be lectured? Miller's history explains why he approached the confrontation with Crockett the way he did. He believed, as always, that his mastery of language, his sharp elbows, his unyielding certainty would give him the upper hand. To him, this was just another duel to be won, another opponent to be outmaneuvered, another chance to prove his dominance. But history also foreshadowed his flaw. Confidence built on intimidation is brittle. It holds only as long as no one dares to press against it. And in that debate on that stage in front of those cameras, Stephen Miller's trademark arrogance was about to meet its limit, because arrogance can only carry you so far, and Jasmine Crockett was waiting too. Understand Jasmine Crockett's presence in that debate room? You must first understand where she came from. Hers is not the story of inherited privilege or cushioned ascents into power. It is the story of grit, forged in fire. Of a woman who carried the weight of service and sacrifice long before she ever set foot in Congress. Crockett was raised in a world where dignity wasn't given freely. It had to be defended. Her parents instilled in her not only discipline, but a fierce sense of duty to family, to community, to those who had less but deserved more. From a young age, she saw up close what injustice looked like. Not as an abstract talking point, but as a lived reality that shaped entire neighborhoods. She learned that America's promises didn't always reach the people who needed them most. And instead of growing bitter, she grew determined. That determination carried her into law, where she chose not the comfortable path of corporate firms or the lucrative corridors of influence, but the trenches of public defense. Day after day, case after case, Crockett fought for those who society too often ignored: the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. She sat across from people whose stories were never told, who lacked not only resources but sometimes even hope. She listened, she believed, and she fought. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was in those battles that Crockett's voice was sharpened. She learned how to stand before judges and prosecutors, how to dissect an argument with precision, how to hold her ground when every ounce of the system leaned against her. She discovered the power of clarity, the kind of clarity that cuts through noise and leaves no room for doubt. In courtrooms where lives hung in the balance, there was no space for arrogance, no reward for theatrics. There was only truth, persistence, the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. This foundation shaped everything that came after. When Crockett stepped into politics, she carried that courtroom spirit with her. She was not there to trade pleasantries or to climb ladders for the sake of ambition. She was there because she understood deeply and personally what was at stake when policy failed, when systems faltered, when leaders turned their backs on those who depended on them. Her campaign speeches weren't abstract rhetoric. They were lived testimony, a bridge between her community's struggles and the nation's conscience. Her rise was not without obstacles. Critics underestimated her, dismissed her, mocked her sharp tongue and her unapologetic pride. But Crockett had long since grown immune to condescension. Each sneer became fuel. Each attempt to silence her became another reason to raise her voice louder. Where others might have folded, she doubled down. Not because she craved recognition, but because she knew too well what silence costs. In Congress, she quickly became a force. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because truth, once unleashed, refuses to hide. Crockett spoke with a rhythm that carried the weight of lived struggle. She asked the questions others avoided. She refused to let arrogance go unchecked. For her constituents, she wasn't just a representative. She was proof that their stories, their pain, their resilience belonged in the heart of American power. And yet, what made her formidable was not aggression. It was balance. She wielded fire without ever losing composure. She carried strength without abandoning grace. She embodied the kind of leadership that doesn't perform for applause, but resonates because it is real. People didn't just listen to Crockett. They felt her. They recognized in her a reflection of their own battles, their own hopes, their own insistence on dignity in the face of disdain. That was the woman who sat across from Stephen Miller. He saw a target. He saw someone to corner, to belittle, to trap with clever phrasing. But what he didn't see was the lifetime of preparation that had already armed her for that exact moment. He didn't see the childhood lessons about service and sacrifice. He didn't see the years in courtrooms where every word mattered. He didn't see the political fights where underestimation became her greatest weapon. What Miller mistook for a vulnerable opponent was, in truth, a seasoned warrior. Crockett didn't need to match his arrogance with arrogance. She had something far more dangerous: authenticity. And when wielded against bluster, authenticity is devastating. So as she narrowed her eyes that night, as silence hung in the air like a gathering storm, Crockett was not scrambling for words. She was drawing on a lifetime of lessons, a lifetime of battles, a lifetime of refusing to be diminished. And when Miller tried to corner her, Crockett's life story had already armed her with the perfect response. The first exchange landed like the opening bell of a heavyweight fight. Stephen Miller, leaning into his trademark smugness, pressed forward with a condescending question meant to box Jasmine Crockett into a corner. His words dripped with disdain, as though her very presence in that room was an inconvenience he intended to swat away. "You speak of justice," he sneered. "But isn't it true that your so-called solutions only weaken the very fabric of this nation? How do you expect America to survive if we cater to everyone's grievances instead of defending its core?" It was classic Miller: broad strokes, loaded phrasing, a tone designed to sound definitive. He expected Crockett to stumble, to backtrack, to fumble under the weight of his insinuations. Instead, she remained still, calm. Her expression revealed no panic, no desperation, only focus. She answered slowly, each word deliberate, each sentence a blade cutting through the fog of Miller's bluster. "The fabric of this nation," she began, her voice steady but firm, "has always been strengthened by those who dared to expand its promise, not by those who tried to shrink it. America survives because people refuse to be excluded from its story." The crowd shifted. Miller's smirk faltered just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but the camera caught it. He tried again, this time raising his volume, pressing harder. "You think slogans and platitudes will hold up in the real world? The truth is, your policies open the door to chaos. You invite lawlessness. You invite danger?" Crockett tilted her head, almost amused. "What you call chaos, Mr. Miller, history calls progress. Every generation has been told that inclusion will destroy us. And every generation proves that inclusion is the only thing that saves us." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, electric, the kind of silence that exposes weakness. Miller's fingers twitched against his stack of papers, gripping them tighter as though the documents themselves could restore the authority slipping from his grasp. He launched into another attack, layering statistics and hypotheticals meant to overwhelm. But Crockett never raised her voice, never let his pace dictate her own. She answered point by point, not hurried, not defensive, but unshakably clear. Her calmness contrasted so starkly with Miller's agitation that the power dynamic of the room began to shift. Viewers could feel it, the slow unraveling of Miller's dominance, the rising steadiness of Crockett's control. With every exchange, Miller's mask cracked further, the sweat beginning to form at his temple, the tightening of his jaw, the way he leaned further forward as though physical proximity might give him back the upper hand. But the more he pressed, the more Crockett's composure stood in quiet defiance. Turning his aggression into its own undoing, the audience could sense it. They leaned closer to their screens, waiting for the tipping point. This wasn't just verbal sparring anymore. It was a battle of composure versus chaos, authenticity versus arrogance. And Miller was slipping. Crockett, sensing the moment, didn't rush. She let him exhaust himself, let him throw his rehearsed lines, his sharpened barbs, his familiar tactics. And when his latest barrage fell flat, when his words hung in the air with no applause, she chose that moment to strike. Her eyes locked on his. Her body leaned forward, just slightly, enough to signal that the tide had turned. And her voice, calm but cutting, prepared to deliver the blow that no smug grin could deflect. And then Crockett leaned in with words that made the room erupt. The silence that stretched across the room was almost unbearable. Cameras zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett's face, calm, steady, her expression unreadable yet electric with intent. Across from her, Stephen Miller tried to hold his composure, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. He thought his barrage of attacks had left her cornered. Instead, he was the one suspended in uncertainty, waiting for the blow he could feel coming. Crockett finally broke the silence. Her words landed softly at first, almost conversational, but with a precision that cut sharper than any raised voice. "You say inclusion weakens America," she began, "but history says otherwise. Every advance this country has ever made, every stride forward has come not from closing doors, but from opening them." She leaned back slightly, letting the weight of her words linger. The audience felt the rhythm. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't flustered. She was setting the tempo now. Miller had no choice but to follow it. "You talk about protecting America's foundation," she continued. "But what is a foundation worth if it cannot support the people who live on it? What kind of house do you build when you tell half the neighbors they don't belong inside?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Miller's eyes darted left, then right, searching for a foothold, a place to wedge his smirk back into the exchange. But Crockett wasn't finished. "Let's be clear," she said, voice tightening. "You call it chaos when black children march for their right to sit in a classroom. You call it chaos when immigrants demand fair treatment after paying their taxes and working 2 jobs. You call it chaos when women raise their voices to be heard in their own country. But history doesn't call that chaos, Mr. Miller. History calls that courage." The words struck like thunder. The room erupted in applause, and the cameras caught Miller's attempt at a grin. Awkward, brittle, stretched too thin to convince anyone he still felt in control. Crockett didn't give him space to recover. She pressed forward, her tone sharpening with each sentence. "You say law and order is your guiding star, yet you defend policies that ripped children from their parents' arms at the border. You say you care about sovereignty, yet your entire playbook has been to pit Americans against one another, weakening the very fabric you claim to protect. You say you want to defend our future, but all I see is a man terrified of it." Gasps rippled across the audience. Miller shifted in his chair, his hands tightening on his papers until they crumpled at the edges. His trademark confidence was unraveling, strand by strand, and then Crockett paused. She let the silence return, but this time she owned it. Her eyes locked on Miller's, unwavering, almost surgical in their intensity. The pause wasn't hesitation. It was suspense. It was power. When she spoke again, her words were crisp, unforgettable. "Stephen, you've made a career out of telling people who doesn't belong in America. But here's the truth you can't handle. The people you try to silence, people you try to exclude, the people you underestimate. We are America. And no amount of fear-mongering can erase us." The room exploded. Applause thundered. People rose from their seats. Miller's face drained of color, his forced smirk collapsing into something closer to panic. He tried to interject, raising a finger, fumbling for a rebuttal, but the noise drowned him out. The cameras caught it all, the one smug architect of exclusion now visibly rattled. His voice lost beneath the roar of affirmation for Crockett's words, and beyond the debate hall. The shockwaves began instantly. On Twitter, hashtags erupted. Hashtag Crockett crushes Miller, hashtag We Are America, hashtag mic drop moment. Clips of her takedown flooded timelines within minutes. One user wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just dismantled Miller in real time. This is history." Another posted a gif of Miller's face mid-silence with the caption, "When you realize arrogance isn't an argument, memes spread like wildfire." A split screen of Miller smirking at the start and looking rattled at the end, captioned, "Confidence. Until it's not." TikTok users layered Crockett's line, "We are America," over swelling music, transforming it into a rallying cry. Commentators rushed to weigh in. A late-night host tweeted, "Stephen Miller thought he brought a sword." Turns out, Jasmine Crockett showed up with the entire arsenal of truth. Activists hailed it as a turning point. A moment of clarity in an era clouded by division. Even neutral observers admitted this was more than a good line. It was a decisive blow. Inside the room, the contrast was cinematic. Miller sat stiff, his papers crumpled in his fists, his mouth opening and closing without words. Crockett, by contrast, leaned back, her expression calm once again, her body language radiating control. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The victory was written in every reaction around her, in every camera angle, replaying the moment across the nation. This was the unraveling of Miller's confidence. The man who had built his reputation on intimidation, relied on his smirk to silence challengers, had finally met someone immune to his tactics. And the immunity wasn't just Crockett's alone. It was shared by every viewer who felt validated. Every immigrant who saw themselves defended. Every American who had ever been told they didn't belong. The brilliance of her counterattack wasn't just the logic. It was the emotion, the authenticity, the undeniable resonance of a truth spoken plainly in a room accustomed to bluster. Miller tried to rattle her, but in the end, it was he who was rattled. And as the applause thundered, as social media turned her words into a movement, Stephen Miller sat in stunned silence, a man undone, not by chaos, but by clarity. By the time Miller realized what had happened, it was already too late. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her line, the world didn't just hear it, it felt it. The debate room was still buzzing, the applause echoing, when the first clips began flooding online. Within minutes, timelines were on fire. Twitter's trending bar lit up like a marquee. Hashtag We Are America. Hashtag Crockett vs. Miller. Hashtag Mic Drop Moment. Each hashtag pulsed with thousands of voices, all repeating the same refrain. Crockett hadn't just won the exchange. She had defined it. Commentators scrambled to capture the electricity of the moment. Political analysts replayed the clip in slow motion, dissecting Miller's collapsing composure frame by frame. One pundit remarked, "You can actually see the smirk drain off his face, like someone pulling a plug." Another said, "This wasn't just an argument lost. This was a philosophy exposed." On Instagram, influencers spliced Crockett's words into montages with soaring music, overlaying them with images of marches, immigrant families, and American flags waving under a golden sky. TikTok creators looped her declaration, "We Are America," into dance tracks, turning it into a rallying anthem that teenagers and activists alike could shout along to. The sound went viral, racking up millions of uses in less than 24 hours. Celebrities quickly joined the chorus. An A-list actor tweeted, "Crockett just delivered the line of the decade." Somebody put this on a billboard. A chart-topping musician reposted the clip with the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." Even sports stars chimed in, sharing the moment as motivation before big games. It was more than politics, it had become culture. Meanwhile, Miller became the punchline. Memes of his stunned expression exploded across the internet. One viral post showed his before and after expressions with the caption, "Expectation versus reality." Another depicted him clutching crumpled papers with the phrase, "When your plan doesn't survive first contact with Jasmine Crockett." Late-night comedians turned the footage into recurring gags, looping his silence for laughs, but for every laugh at Miller's expense, there was a deeper current of admiration flowing toward Crockett. Grassroots organizations posted, "This is why representation matters. This is why voices like Jasmine's change everything." Young activists quoted her in speeches at rallies, holding up placards that read, "We Are America." In bold letters, cable news shows replayed the clip on a loop, hosts marveling at her composure. One commentator noted, in an era when shouting matches dominate the screen, Crockett proved that calm truth cuts sharper than bluster. Another added, "This wasn't just a soundbite. This was a turning point." Even those who normally avoided politics found themselves swept up in the momentum. Family group chats lit up with the clip, uncles and cousins trading the video back and forth. Students pulled it up in classrooms, sparking discussions about identity, dignity, and courage. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone on a national stage say, without hesitation, that inclusion wasn't a threat, but the very essence of America. And as the hours turned into days, the wave didn't recede, it grew. Online petitions launched, calling for Crockett's words to be printed on murals and taught in civics classes. T-shirt companies rushed to print designs with her, quote, selling out in record time. Commentators began describing it as a watershed moment, the kind of clip that doesn't fade into the endless churn of content, but stays etched in memory. Meanwhile, Miller tried to recover. He gave a follow-up interview where he dismissed Crockett's remarks as emotional rhetoric. but the attempt fell flat. Every clip of him speaking was met with side-by-side comparisons of Crockett's calm takedown. He looked smaller, diminished, his arrogance exposed as hollow. His words no longer carried the sting he had once relied on. The energy was different for Crockett. She wasn't just seen as a politician anymore. She was seen as a symbol of defiance, of dignity, of what it means to stand firm when arrogance tries to push you aside. People didn't just admire her, they identified with her. She became a mirror in which millions saw themselves, finally represented with clarity and strength. The debate had ended, but its impact had only begun. Clips spread across continents, translated into subtitles in half a dozen languages, sparking conversations in places far removed from the American political stage. What people saw wasn't just a clash between two individuals. They saw a microcosm of a larger struggle: arrogance versus authenticity, exclusion versus belonging. The memes were funny. The hashtags were catchy. The applause was deafening. But under all of it, there was something deeper, something enduring. Because the true legacy of this clash wasn't just the memes, it was the lesson it carried. When the noise of the debate finally dimmed, what remained was not just the memory of a clash, but the resonance of a principle too powerful to ignore. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't matched Miller's sneer with venom of her own. Instead, she had chosen dignity. And in doing so, she revealed something profound: that arrogance, no matter how loud, cannot withstand the steady weight of truth. Her performance was more than a tactical victory. It was a parable. For every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, for every young woman dismissed in a boardroom, for every working-class parent overlooked by the powerful, Crockett's moment was validation. It said, "You don't need to become what they accuse you of being. You don't need to bend to their arrogance. Stand in your truth, and it will speak louder than any insult ever could." That was the brilliance of her response. Miller tried to weaponize division, painting inclusion as weakness. But Crockett turned it into strength, reframing belonging as the very heart of America. In a single exchange, she pulled the debate out of the mud of policy sparring and lifted it into the realm of values. She reminded everyone listening that this fight was never just about one law, one policy, or one politician. It was about who we are and who we choose to be. And for millions watching, her message landed with the force of recognition. Viewers wrote online, "I saw myself in her words." Others said, "For the first time in a long time, I felt proud." The clip became more than entertainment. It became a moment of collective affirmation. It's easy in politics to believe that cynicism always wins, that the loudest and most arrogant voices will dominate the conversation. But Crockett showed that calm conviction could cut sharper than rage, and that composure could become its own form of power. She demonstrated that victory doesn't always look like overpowering your opponent. Sometimes, victory is simply refusing to let arrogance define the terms of the fight. Her presence on that stage carried echoes of every underdog story this country has ever known. The immigrant who works twice as hard just to be seen as equal. The young activist dismissed as naive until their vision reshapes the world. The overlooked community whose persistence eventually bends history. Crockett's moment stood for all of them. It wasn't just her triumph. It was theirs. And that's why the clip didn't fade. It endured because it tapped into something universal: the desire to be seen, the right to belong, the truth that dignity outlasts bluster. Miller had tried to shrink her into a stereotype. Instead, she expanded the stage, turning the spotlight back onto the American promise itself. As commentators wrapped their coverage, as hashtags trended and memes circulated, one truth became inescapable: arrogance had met its match. And it wasn't anger that defeated it. It was dignity. Crockett left that stage not just as a politician who had won a debate, but as a reminder of something deeper: that the arc of the American story is bent not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who stand the firmest. And as the dust settled, one question lingered in every viewer's mind. Stephen Miller thought he had found the perfect moment, a trap that would corner Jasmine Crockett and leave her scrambling. Instead, his arrogance became the stage for one of the most unforgettable mic drops in recent political memory. He tried to outsmart her, but in those few seconds, the tables turned. And what he instantly regretted was not just a lost exchange, it was the realization that dignity and truth will always outshine bluster and condescension. This wasn't just Crockett's victory. It was a reminder for everyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they don't belong. Her calm defiance proved that arrogance cannot survive the weight of truth. And that is why this moment matters, not just as political theater, but as a spark of inspiration for all of us. Because the truth is, this story doesn't end here. It continues with you, with how you carry it forward, how you share it, how you let it remind you of your own strength. When you amplify voices like Crockett's, you help build a future where dignity wins, where inclusion isn't attacked but celebrated, and where justice isn't just a word, but a lived reality. So if this moment moved you, if you felt that rush of recognition, that pride, that sense of belonging, don't let it fade. Share this video. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. And most importantly, carry this energy into your own life, into your own battles. Knowing that arrogance may shout, but dignity endures. This was more than a debate. It was a reminder of who we are. And together, we can make sure that reminder is never forgotten.